Now, I have been asked to talk about two issues of great concern to the ACLU of Massachusetts, the organization I work for: the surveillance of peace activists in Boston and the Tariq Mahana case, which you will hear more of in an afternoon, I think it's an afternoon workshop. While Muslims have borne the brunt of the nation's, I would call it a monomaniacal focus on terrorism since 9/11, dissent is being steadily criminalized as, quote, a secretive, unaccountable post-9/11 homeland security apparatus has increasingly turned inward on American citizens, end quote. That is a quote from Colleen Rowley. Many of you may know she's a former FBI agent and whistleblower. Looking beyond the targeting of specific groups, I'd like to end my remarks really dovetailing in what you've heard already. The way we are all now in this together, because we are all now potential suspects. And this is a subject which will be focused on at greater length in one of the workshops. And to find out more about it, if you don't attend my workshop, take one of these pieces of paper from over there. We have a special website devoted to this subject called privacysos.org. The Privacy Matters blog we update every day with the latest on the surveillance state. Now, let me start by giving you the flavor of what gets collected as quote-unquote intelligence by the Boston Police, working with its local fusion center known as the BRIC, that's the Boston Regional Intelligence Center, and retained as searchable electronic database. All of these intelligence files are retained in this database under the heading, quote, criminal act-groups-extremists. Okay, here's one of them. Quote, anti-war activist, redacted, will be speaking at the Central Congregational Church. Local activists have been trying to get celebrity guest speakers, Sean Penn, Susan Sarandon, for the March 24th demonstration, but at this time it appears that they have been unable to book any of those speakers for their event, end quote. How criminal is this? This is one of the intelligence reports and hundreds of hours of videotape surveillance obtained from the Boston Police through a court order. The ACLU of Massachusetts and the Massachusetts chapter of the National Lawyers Guild had sued on behalf of 6 peace groups and 4 individual activists after the police stonewalled us on our public records request for the information. And these extremist groups, let me just quickly run off what they were: Code Pink of Greater Boston, the Smedley Butler Brigade of Veterans for Peace, Greater Boston Stop the Wars Coalition, the Boston Coalition for Palestinian Rights, Political Research Association, and United for Justice for Peace. The documents we received reveal that surveillance teams have been tracking activists for years, have been monitoring their internal deliberations, internet communications, events and demonstrations, have been reporting on their political beliefs, and relied on outside intelligence such as FBI sources for information on constitutionally protected expression. And they also tried to get activists to spy on each other. In so doing, they have violated not just the Constitution, but federal rules and their own guidelines. Because fusion centers like the BRIC are supposed to, which are set up, and I'm sure you all know this, to analyze and share terrorist-related information. That's what they were set up to do. And they're supposed to share it among federal, state, and local agencies. They get funds from the DHS, and according to federal regulations, such federally funded surveillance projects may collect and maintain information on individuals, quote, only if there is reasonable suspicion that the individual is involved in criminal conduct or activity and that the information is relevant to criminal activity. That's the government regulation. And that's one of BRIC's own guidelines. It says the same thing. These guidelines also say that, quote unquote, intelligence reports that do not reference criminal activity should be destroyed after 90 days. The intelligence reports we obtained had no link to crime or terrorism, and some of them were still being retained after 5 years. Given the secrecy surrounding the intelligence sharing surveillance systems that have been erected since 9/11, and the lack of any accountability mechanisms, We have no idea how widely these reports were shared or where exactly they have ended up. Inaccurate information could have found a permanent home in a myriad government and even private databases, with harm to lives that can never be repaired. Now, BRICS intelligence operations confirmed the observation of a recent Senate subcommittee report that fusion centers, quote, produce a lot of predominantly useless information, end quote, and, quote, at times a bunch of crap, end quote. We have called on the Commonwealth of Massachusetts to immediately cease funding Massachusetts' 2 fusion centers and are filing a bill in the state legislature that would prevent law enforcement from collecting information about lawful First Amendment protected activity without reasonable suspicion that it relates to crime. So now let me turn to the Tariq Mahana case. FBI raids and arrests of Muslims have received, of course, sensational media coverage, leading the public to assume that Muslims are a unique terrorist threat. But if you look at the FBI's own reports, they show that Muslims are not, in fact, chiefly responsible for supposed terrorist incidents and plots within the US. They detail plots by white supremacy and other groups that would have dominated the news if Muslims had been involved. Now, I'm not going to go into the changes in FBI guidelines and the mapping and the demographic profiling, all of that, because I'm sure people here are aware of that and will hear more about it in the workshops. But let me just say that a lot of this interviews of Muslims are used to recruit informers. I was given 15 minutes, so that can't, have I done 10 already? What? I've done 10? Oh, I better gallop. Okay. What? Okay. I better hurry. So one person who refused to become an informer was Tariq Mahana, who was sentenced last April to 17 and a half years after being convicted of terrorism charges. Now, let me just quickly say what makes this case. You see that wall of people, and in ways, you know, Tariq is not unique from the other people on that wall, but in one way, it strikes me he is unique, because his sentencing came only 3 weeks after a Michigan federal judge threw out the most serious charges facing 7 members of the Houthi militia. These were self-described Christian warriors who planned to kill a police officer and then bomb his funeral. And they had an incredible arsenal of weapons. By the time they were raided, they had amassed machine guns, assault rifles, 148,000 rounds of ammunition, body armor, tear gas, knives, and they were drilling in the forest to carry out this attack. Now, imagine what would have happened to Muslims found with this kind of arsenal. Judge Victoria Roberts declared that the case against the Houthi was, quote, built largely of circumstantial evidence that the alleged plot to kill a local police officer was just them venting, that it hadn't really become specified, the details of the plot, and she basically said this was protected First Amendment activity. As for Tariq Mahana, he never had a gun, he never was involved in any plot to kill anyone, and from the time he was a teenager, he was subjected to every kind of surveillance the FBI could muster, secret peek and sneak and peek searches, FISA wiretaps, the seizure of his emails, the use of informants against him. He says he was told that unless he himself became an informant, the FBI would make his life hell. Now, after spending nearly 3 years in solitary confinement, the young pharmacist was convicted of traveling to Yemen 8 years previously for military training, which he never in fact had, of lying to the FBI, and of translating and disseminating classical and other Islamic texts into English, which prosecutors deemed, quote, material support to terrorism. Now, in a striking departure from Judge Victoria Roberts, Judge George O'Toole in the Boston Federal District Court refused to allow the First Amendment to be introduced in the Mahana case. He refused to admit our brief asking for most of the charges to be dismissed on First Amendment grounds. Not only did both the prosecutor and the judge shun any discussion about what the First Amendment does and does not protect, they steered clear of the Supreme Court's 2010 Holder versus Humanitarian Law Project ruling. If you don't know about that, please look it up, because that is the material support ruling that carves out basically First Amendment. If you give any kind of aid, even if you're trying to do nonviolence training with a group on the terrorism list, you can be prosecuted. However, the ruling also says if it's just independent advocacy, that is protected under the First Amendment. And nothing that was introduced in this trial showed it was anything other than independent advocacy. There was no link made with any terrorist group. However, the Boston court decided views expressed by Muslims will not be protected if they fall into the dangerous radicalization category, because that's really what they got Tarek Mahana on. It's not even legal, and I hope it'll be overturned on appeal. But basically, the prosecutor said that his reluctance to assist the government, that is to become an informant, showed that he had bad intentions, quote, and the impact of the harms created through his work of translating documents is huge. We don't know how many may have been radicalized. People around the world are consuming his work. The damage he has done will linger. So, basically, it is my view and the view of his lawyers that in this country, Muslims, there's a Muslim exception to the First Amendment. And this is something we really have got to work to overcome. We now live in a country in which there's not only that Muslim exception, but many Americans seem prepared to go along and see certain groups stripped of their constitutional rights. And I see my time is up, so I don't have time to really go into the final part of my remarks, which was to show how those Americans who are so basically willing to see these rights stripped away are themselves endangered by this security state. Because we really have all been now suspects by putting input into these massive databases and having the notion of pre-crime replace the whole notion of reasonable suspicion of criminal activity. So if you want to hear more about that, please attend my workshop. Thank you.